Segundo.
Buenos días y bienvenidos a todos y a todas a un nuevo semestre de la maestría en bioética. ¿Ahí? Sí. Un nuevo semestre de la maestría en bioética. Le damos la bienvenida sobre todo pues, a los neojaverianos que están hoy con nosotros y también pues, a toda la comunidad del Instituto de Bioética y de la Javeriana. Y para inaugurar este nuevo semestre tenemos una invitada muy especial, que es la profesora Irene Klaver. Ella es de Países Bajos y su maestría en ciencia política en la Universidad de Ámsterdam y luego hizo su doctorado en filosofía en Estados Unidos y ahora es profesora de filosofía ambiental en la Universidad de Texas en Denton y coordina el proyecto sobre filosofía del agua en la misma universidad. Y también la profesora Klaver trabajó en un proyecto grande de 5 años con la UNESCO, que buscaba como promover el diálogo entre gente que trabajaba desde, digamos, el área de la ciencia sobre proyectos de agua con una mirada más desde las humanidades y las ciencias sociales. Entonces, bienvenida, profesora Irene. Y antes de empezar la conferencia, quería decirles que Irene va a hablar la charla en inglés, en la serie de preguntas y respuestas va a ser en español, la pueden hacer en español y yo puedo traducir las preguntas. Irene me ha pedido también, si puedes poner la charla, la presentación, solo porque es muy importante para la presentación aclarar el término meandering, ¿sí? Entonces, meandering en inglés tiene 2 significados, que es la misma palabra, pero en español no funciona de la misma manera. Un significado es como la sinuosidad de un río, ¿sí? Entonces, el meandering es como eso, es como el río que naturalmente es sinuoso. Y el otro significado es un poco como esa misma idea, pero traslada al pensamiento, a la escritura, al habla. Y es como, pero tiene generalmente en Occidente tiene un significado negativo. Y es básicamente como cuando uno dice la divagación, ¿no? Que uno divaga cuando está hablando o escribiendo, se va por las ramas, ¿no? Ese es el otro sentido de meandering, ¿sí? Entonces, la profesora Irene quería tenerlo claro antes de empezar, pues porque ese es como, digamos, la clave de su charla, porque ella quiere reinterpretar este concepto de meandering y realmente darle una connotación positiva. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Thank you so much for being here. Y bienvenidos.
Gracias, Laura, and gracias todas por venir aquí. Unfortunately, I cannot give the talk in Spanish. Maybe 10 years from now, but not right now. Can you hear me? Sí, okay. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you and to share my thinking about meandering, which is a basic concept for rivers, as Laura explained, but also a basic concept about the way of our thinking, the linearity, the straight line of our thinking as a model of efficiency. So the talk is basically about revaluing meandering as a practical moment in valuing meandering of rivers, but also a revaluing of another mode of thinking that takes more time, that takes more possibilities into consideration. So in my talk, I will show you that shift in thinking, which I see as a major shift in our epistemology, our way of thinking, and our way of being in the 21st century. Claro? Gracias. Yeah, okay. As Laura mentioned, I worked at UNESCO for a year and worked on a project for 5 years to connect the water sector, which is the major science sector of the S of UNESCO, to connect that water sector with the cultural sector, because there was no connection between the two. And so we set up this project 10 years ago, and it became a very important project to actually integrate water and cultural diversity. And that's basic for the logic of my talk of reconnecting meandering to our thinking and our being. We produced this book and also a lot of other practical engagements. The water project of the UNESCO is called the International Hydrological Program. Water is the most important pillar for UNESCO, precisely because of health reasons. So I thought it was nice for you to know as bioethicists, because most people worldwide die of waterborne diseases. A lot of young children, a lot of malaria or bilharzia and other waterborne diseases. So that's the background. Part of the talk, the main part of the talk, is about showing how water should and could be seen and is a connecting element. Actually, one moment, excuse me. I forgot to do this. Water is a connecting element. That's the basic thesis of the paper. It's connecting as a biocultural dynamic, relating biodiversity with cultural diversity. And it instantiates mentalities, worldviews, religious abstract concepts in specific practices, and vice versa. It connects specificities to generalities. And rivers, meandering as such, shows that connectivity, because a river is not only water, it's water and sediments, water and soil. I'm going to read part of the paper, but this is the background. There is not one way of water. There are many ways, and many ways of knowing water, the epistemology of water. Multiplicity and complexity is intrinsic to water. Water is always in relation. It is relation. Water is with. It is humid, wet, fluid, and frozen. It is in the air, in the atmosphere, the soil, in the ice, but also in the rice and in the bodies. It is in every cell of our body. It is in our blood and our cultures. It makes mountains crumble and trees stand straight. It makes people fight and celebrate. Water branches into relations, in ramifications, in nations, in constellations. It engages actively and passively. It flows, drips, sits, sinks, mists, melts, oozes, freezes, rains, cascades, and evaporates. It rarely travels in straight lines. Only when it is engineered and piped and ditched, it does travel in straight lines. Because of its relationality of water, it does not let itself be reduced to simplicity. Its self, water, is many, is not just one thing. It's many different things, it's relationalities. Water always comes back into its complexity. It resists being reduced to simplicity. Human time of trade schedules and production tables has stratified water into manageable and measurable entities, into canals, into into dams, etc. It had dams, rivers, and other infrastructural units. Water has become controlled and reduced and produced and confined. It has been turned into isolated water units. So it has lost its connectivity. Are you still, can you still follow? Can you follow my English? See? Okay. It goes slow enough. Okay. It has become controlled space, functional space, a commodity, shipping channels, irrigation systems, hydropower, drinking water, wastewater, all separate units of water. It has lost in this ordering and compartmentalization, it has lost its relationality and lost its complexity. All those became backgrounded or often undergrounded, like here in Bogotá, waters are under us. We have made water divisible. We have divided it. We have made it invisible, mute. It has lost its trace and grace. I argue that this is structured to the structuring of the world in modernity into separate domains, water and land, order and messiness. It imposes ontologies, ways of being upon water, instead of letting the ontology of water, the being of water, guide us in how we should or live with water. But water keeps interrupting. It punctures holes in the ways we have ordered and controlled water. It keeps also, epistemologically speaking, muddying our concepts, our models. Our order was imposed, our order on water was imposed to control droughts, to control floods. But water has punctured, has gone through our dikes, or has stayed away in the droughts. And we blamed the river for the puncturing. Floods and droughts are seen as problems for our model of order caused by water. But water shows us, let us know, water tells us to rethink, to reorder our orderings. This means that we need to find ways of alternatives to our models that have given rise to the floods, that have given rise to the droughts. We need to find ways that reveal how droughts and floods were created through our ways of ordering. And I will argue that we need to bring back the relationalities that water actually shows us. And in that sense, we need to regenerate other ways of thinking, other ways of living, other orders, other structures. We need an ontology, a way of being, and an epistemology, and an ethics of connection, of relation. And I call that ethics, that ontology, that epistemology, an ethics, ontology, epistemology of meandering. This means finding new and innovative ways of thinking, inhabiting, designing, organizing, being and behaving with water. Ways which accommodate and follow the multiple ways that water is, that water travels, behaves, acts, relates, and cognates. It means giving up our rigid ways of categorizing, thinking, living, while regenerating flexibility in our ordering. This entails active decisions, interventions, conscious changes in the way we have ordered our society. Giving up means a change in policy, in economy, in culture. And I argue that water guides the way because it shows how problematic our orders are with the floods, with the droughts and all. In all its fluid gentleness, its persistence, and its violence, it seduces us, but also forces us to change, to innovate our technologies, but also our thinking, our being, acting, and engaging. Climate change-driven floods and droughts in the 21st century have put water back on the map. It has created new words, new professions, new offices of resilience and recovery, and new projects. If it really has changed our way of thinking is still to be seen. And that's what I try to implement in my own writing and acting and publishing. Where rivers have long been foregrounded as anchors of civilization since ancient times, they became backgrounded in the era of modernity. Specifically in the industrial era, many rivers, many waterways became polluted, diverted, dammed, and paved over. They disappeared. They also disappeared from the cultural imagination. And I want to show some of the, just here, what I want to show here with this picture is how meandering was a very widespread activity. This is one of the oldest maps that a person, a geographer, reinvented called Fisk in 1944. And he showed the wild meandering if you let a river go its own ways. It permanently changed. Of course, that was made impossible as soon as you want to have navigation, as soon as you have private property of the lands around the water, then this whole dynamic needs to be stratified. And so that's what happened in with the American Corps of Engineers. This meander pattern is gone. The river is made straight. It has caused a lot of floods, as you can imagine. And so in a way, you could argue that floods only exist when we draw a line. A flood is water crossing a line which is drawn. When we don't draw that line, there is no flood. Flood is a human construction in that sense. And a lot of indigenous cultures and the indigenous cultures that lived around the Mississippi River, They lived with the floods. They didn't have a concept of floods. Floods were there. They were actually fertile. They gave new soil. They gave new water. They gave fresh water. They lived with the dynamic of the floods. There was no flood for them. Let me go to the next slide. What I just mentioned before in modernity, and an architect, Le Corbusier, you know Corbusier, Le Corbusier, is a very famous architect, a very famous architect of modernity. For him, the law of the meander was to cut through it. It's a kind of paradigmatic modernist concept of a model of efficiency, because it takes a long way for navigation to follow all the meanders. It's much more efficient to have a straight line. So for efficiency of navigation, but also efficiency of private property, the river needed to be stopped meandering. And that was exactly also the modernist ideology of Le Corbusier. And so you see the effect here. This is the Los Angeles River. You see the same of the river here in Bogotá. The rivers are just straight lines. However, in the 21st century, we see all kinds of projects to re-meander rivers. It was a huge shift in mentality that actually guided this whole process. This didn't just happen. It meant an understanding of the importance of natural processes. It meant a shift towards biocultural imagination. It was the consequence of an emerging environmental movement, culminating in the United States, but in many other places in environmental legislation, all kinds of environmental laws. This facilitated a renewed foregrounding of rivers in city planning. Rivers, I argue, meandered back into our cultural imagination. So we see a meandering of the river itself into our culture. At the same time, you could argue, has the mentality really changed? Because a lot of these processes are also guided by tourism, by another way of making the river actually profitable for a new kind of economy, etc. So what I want to foreground here in the rest of my talk is actually pushing this meandering, this re-meandering back into the cultural imagination of meandering itself, and show what the ramifications are of a real rethinking of that re-meandering. Okay, are you still with me? Good. Okay. To explain that new form of thinking, I'm going back in order to make a step forward. I'm going back in history, where the origin of meander and actually the negative approach of meander came from. And that has to do with the river meander itself. Let me first say a little bit about this, because this is actually really kind of funny. So this is the re-meandering of the Los Angeles River. You see here one there. So this is the way it was, and this is the way it is actually right now. These are the plans, but it has happened already. This was a long-term project for the city of Los Angeles, and it had a lot of public engagement, etc. So they had a lot of outreach. They had flyers like this. And when I saw this, I did a project on the Los Angeles River. And when I saw this, it was like, they've read my articles. And of course they hadn't, you know, who read the articles of philosophers, only other philosophers. But look, all the words they used: reclaim, revitalize the river, reimagine the river. I had never imagined that a city council would use these kind of words, you know, they're so philosophical to reimagine a river. And we will not talk about all the details, but it's in the air to rethink how we relate to our water bodies, even by public administrators. Okay. It's not going forward. Oh. And so the whole flyer had also revitalization and reconnect. And reconnect was really, that's really my central word because it has that element of which is the again and again of meandering itself, to rethink. But it has also the element of connection. And con, the word con is the Latin word of cum. You know, those of you who speak Latin or you know, your Jesuit college, so you all should know a little bit of Latin, I think. So con comes from cum suis, you know, cum. And in Greek, it's xun, so symmetry is xin, is the same root, symmetry, cum. Connection is to really make a with, because cum means with, cum suis, with. You know, you all know that, right? Say just yes. Good. So reconnecting means like to be relational again, relation between water and land, relation between water and culture, etc., etc. This was right in their flyer. It's like, wow, reconnecting. So you see it all over the world, especially actually in the Western world, I have to say, the so-called developed world. This is my hometown, Amsterdam. It's really reconnecting to its water, totally new mentality for the last 20 years. So back to our meander model. What I want to show is that meandering, as I said earlier, it's this relationship between sedimentation, silt, and reactivation. That is what meandering is. For Merleau-Ponty, do you guys know Merleau-Ponty? No? He's a famous French phenomenologist. You don't really have to know him, but he's very interesting. One of my favorite philosophers. And for him, thinking is, as he says here, sedimentation and reactivation. And that is exactly meandering. I was so happy when I read that. It was like one of my favorite philosophers thinks that thinking really is meandering, because sedimentation is the silt and then reactivate and you get a meander. It's an ongoing process. So for Merleau-Ponty, thinking never stops. It always, but you know, for a while it kind of sediments, it has concepts and so forth. But then you need to kind of rethinking because there are new events, new elements that need to be taken up. And so what I argue is that that leads to a slow ontology. A straight line makes the water shoot, go. Meander slows it down. So it takes more elements into consideration. It makes us think about different effects, different vectors and factors that have an influence on something to think with. So it's a slow epistemology, a slow ontology. Another major concept in my meander model is the notion of river sphere. So a river is often seen as just one-dimensional. Well, anyone who knows rivers knows that the whole environment around a river has changed. There's a whole, it's cooler. And of course, under the river, it's also very different. It is all biota that's been created. There's a whole sphere. That's again a deepening of our thinking from flat to a sphere model. And so that's where I use other philosophers like Gernot Böhme and Peter Sloterdijk, a three-dimensional aspect of water. And so ultimately it's kind of in the Deleuzian terms an assemblage of natural, cultural, and infrastructural processes. So here we have the with, the kun, the sim, being and thinking and living with. And that's inspired by another philosopher called Jean-Luc Nancy, whose notion of being is being with. There's no separate being. Our being is always being with. So back to the notion of the history of meander. In Greek, earliest Greek writings, and now I'm talking 700 BC, so that's like Homer's time, and Hesiod. There were ideas of the river gods. Let me read that because that goes faster. Well, maybe that's too much. Let me go just quickly over this because we are running a little bit out of time. So there were thousands of river gods and water nymphs. And here we see in the Roman era, they made some kind of imageries about it. Meander was one of the major river gods. But there were also gods like the Ister, which is the Danube. So a lot of the rivers that are known nowadays had actually old gods in their whole cultural imagination. And as I said, there was a real meander river. So our notion of meandering, which is a very important notion in English, in Dutch, in French, but not in Spanish, apparently. Don't know what happened to you guys, but it's such an important word, meandering. But almost no one knows that actually this word comes from this original river, which was a river in what is now Turkey, or more specifically Anatolia. So that's the Asian part of Turkey. Here you see a map. You see, so it's in Anatolia is within the ellipse at the left side. Well, the interesting thing is that Anatolia was being colonized by the Greeks in like 500, 400 before Christ. And the main Greek, what we say, the first Greek philosophers, Thales of Miletus, Heraclitus of Ephesus, etc., they were actually not from Athens. They were not from Sparta. They were from this area, and this area, the places where they lived were at the mouth of the Meander River. This was not by accident. This was because the Meander River, this river that, here you see precisely the watershed, and in the left you see the where the river's watershed is. This river was actually the gateway from the west to the east. It was the gateway from all the goods from Egypt, from Greece to China, to the east, and vice versa. Spices came back, etc. So it was a very important trade route. It was also a very important route for the armies of war. Xerxes, so the war from all the old wars in the Greek history went through the Meander River, or through the watershed, through the valley of the Meander River. So it was a very, very important river, actually in the first colonizing of the Greeks of this area. And so what I argue is that actually this very colonization could also be seen as the first modernization of the river, because soon after that it became such an important gateway with Ephesus and Miletus, Thales, Heraclitus, right at the mouth of the river. Because it was a wealthy society, they had time to actually pay for philosophers, and not every society can do that. At the same time, the area became very overused. And so you got already actually the first environmental effects of human intervention. The effects were that actually, well, let me go through here. You see the kind of middle section of the light blue. That's all sedimentation of the meander. That's the effect of the Meander River. So, like in the right corner, you see meander, and you see that all places became part of the land because the whole bay became sedimented because of the overuse of the valley. So you got erosion. So it was actually the first environmental disaster, but they didn't know. And it was also the beginning of the decline of the whole area. So for a while, it was a very prosperous place, but then it declined because of its own overuse of the place. But as soon as this colonization started, you got also writers like Herodotus, who wrote about the history of Greece and the whole area. And he, in one of his texts, he was talking about the Nile, and he said, the Nile is as bad as the Meander River because it meanders so much. And this meandering is actually such it takes so much time to travel through these valleys and so forth, same for the Nile. And he called this meandering scoliosis. Well, you as health people, you know what scoliosis means, right? It's like, it's a bad thing. So this was the first time in history that actually meandering was seen as terrible, as a problem, as a health issue, a health for the economy, a health for an efficient trade, it's a health for a problem for for all the models of efficiency. So we see that right at the beginning of the meandering, when meandering becomes an element of meandering, we see the negative connotation. So meandering in its material movement conveys the nature of the non-linear, metaphorically and symbolically, and in reality. Meandering allows for ambiguity, for uncertainty. We don't know. They don't know how meandering actually really works. Scientifically, they still cannot predict it. It also allows for hybridity. It cannot be easily measured and replicated. Its activity of sedimentation and reactivation, what Merleau-Ponty calls thinking, is based upon unpredictable workings of the material realm. It's not ruled by structured or scheduled time. It takes its own time. Meandering is in that sense messier than the straight line. And in that sense, it means a rethinking of progress through complexity instead of through simplicity or linearity. As I said, I was already awareness of that in that very era. And it's very interesting that very soon meandering became actually symbolized in art in this stratified way. So the art around meandering became this stylized way. And so, for example, the Shield of Phillips II of Macedonia, who was one of the major conquerors of the East, had this meander pattern. So it was an acknowledgement of how important meandering is. At the same time, it was also an acknowledgement that it needed actually to be straightened in some ways. Very interesting, right from the beginning of time. So what well, let me go back to this and speak a little bit more about meandering. How are we going with time? Oops. Let me try to, to finish off. You understand my basic train of thought, right? Because I can talk about this for hours, but I don't think you'll have time for hours, right? You don't want to stay here for hours. So revaluing meandering has a train of effects on a variety of concepts and practices. It facilitates a different way of thinking about efficiency. Acknowledging that it might be more efficient to actually take a longer route, to take a longer time, more time, to explore possibilities, just as a river does when it meanders through a basin. It is a slower process than water running through a concrete channel. So meandering hints at a different imagination. It elucidates another mindset, a new epistemological and ontological model, and a new cultural and political framework that diversifies what counts as knowledge, what counts as politics. It elucidates relations and solutions as new constructs to imagination. It actually emphasizes an ongoing beginning. Every time you have to rethink given new situations. It's never a creatio ex nihilo. It works with the material that's there. And so in the notion of re-meandering, I will not talk about the notion of métis, but I will say what kind of new models this actually entails. So it means a shift from a model of hydroengineering with its straight line to a thinking and engineering with local cultures, instead of the specialization of engineers that just implement things. You need to work with local cultures to see what the land and their practices have actually revealed. It means also a model that takes practices from Eastern culture more into consideration. Because it's very much the mentality of the West with its notion of control that has been implemented in this stratifying. So I would say in the 20th century, you got the hydrocracy or social engineering of high modernity, progress seen as utilitarian control of nature. In the 21st century, we are looking for a new framework, a new mentality, new culture imagination that actually meanders towards a model of integrating cultural and natural components in engineering and social political decision making that takes situated knowledges. It's a term from another philosopher and anthropologist, Donna Haraway, to take that into consideration into the planning. So a famous artist, Jan Roo, made this difference symbolically between the West and the East. So the West is a straight line, the East is this. So in summary, there's a mentality shift. A meandering as a metaphor for moving through solution space versus the efficiency of straight line. We get that? It means inductive or analogical and emergent reasoning as important as control and generalizability, which are often the only terms that are seen as scientifically important. It leads to an ethics of relationality. I've mentioned it a couple of times. An ethics of intertwinement and entanglement versus an ethics of strict rules. The rules are kind of straight lines. I didn't talk about Métis, but so we'll leave that. It means a foregrounding of the importance of uncertainty and instability and flexibility in that sense. It means a framework of exploration, rethinking, and of ingenuity. And ingenuity is really interesting because the word ingenuity is actually the word that is the same word as the word of engineer. An engineer is an ingenious person. And I've worked a lot with engineering, implemented this model through the UNESCO program. And they all start like, well, we need to do it this way and so forth. And then we talk and I ask how they actually work with local populations, because there's now a requirement that they have to work with local populations. And they actually they really enjoy it. But they have first to say, like, it's such a drag to have to do this. And then but they are ingenious people. They like to actually be ingenious. So it's this framework of meandering is a framework of ingenuity. It allows for a cultural imagination of complexity and diversity. So I made a whole model of that, but we are not going to look at that. Then quickly, the last element, the river sphere that I mentioned briefly, but just we're going to do that really quickly because we are running out of time. Here's first the ethics. We talked already about that. So the river sphere is really an assemblage of, a much larger entity, a whole assemblage of all these elements, a three-dimensional watershed. Ultimately, it facilitates involvement and engagement and integrate environmental flows and cultural flows. And I want to give this example of Isfahan in Iran. I've worked there also in a UNESCO project. Isfahan, have you guys heard of Isfahan? It's a city in Iran, which was really famous, a beautiful, beautiful, important city with a major river. And the river was called Zayanda River. And Zayanda means life giver or river. That's the name of the river. Well, 20 years ago, they built a dam. And so this is what the river looks like nowadays. The consequences are tremendous. The whole river sphere is gone. However, when there is an important guest, say when President Biden comes visit Isfahan, because Isfahan is really the cultural jewel in Iran's crown. Well, I guess Biden is not going to visit Iran. Maybe your president will visit. When a famous person is going to visit Iran, and that happened, they turn on the river because they want to show, this is Isfahan the way we know Isfahan. Isfahan is this rich river culture, and the whole wealth of Isfahan was because of the river. They turn on the river. That's what happens to rivers nowadays. They can be turned on and off by the dam. And I've seen that happening, wow, there's suddenly a river going through town. But this is the way it looks like when there's no famous person in town. This is a river sphere. This is the end of a river sphere. This is the death of a river sphere. This is the death of Isfahan. So this is my last slide. This is the conclusion. Like, think, we consider, we meander, and bioethics include abiotic elements like water and soil, silt, and land. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to some questions. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to try. Good morning, everyone. Professor Irene, thank you. Professor Irene, thank you so much for your beautiful lecture on it by powerful talking about the concept itself. I was wondering, following my personal inquiries, which is, if there is one, which is the role or the significance or the intersection between the concept of meandering with animal life.
Yeah. A very nice question, because meandering in art is often symbolized by the snake, by the serpent. And I think that's also the meaning in Spanish, right? Serpent? Yeah, serpent. Serpentear. And so, and as you know, in Colombian culture, the indigenous Colombian culture, the snake was very, very sacred animal. And in many cultures, the snake is a very sacred animal, precisely because of its meandering movement, and a couple of other reasons. Animals meander by definition, because they are always relating their behavior to the specificities of the place. So if there's no food here, then the bison move on to the next place. And then and any animal moves on to a next place. They find a place to build a shelter depending on the geography of the lands they are in. So I would argue that any animal is a meandering being. And I would argue that also any plant is meandering. So it has not even to do directly with the necessity of movement. But we see that seeds will not sprout when there is terrible drought. Some seeds need drought. But then when there's too much water in climate change circumstances, then actually those seeds might die because there's too much water. They need that 10-year of drought. They might get dispersed in a different area by the birds movement, or by other animal movements. So I would say that all nature is meandering by definition, because of that interconnecting between behavior and space and place and materiality. There is no separation. That whole meandering is based upon the interaction between space and materiality and movement. So yeah, thank you. That's a very nice question. Can you relate to that? Does that answer your question?
Yes, then I find it so inspiring to take this concept to be applied in different questions that I'm working on. This is my field of studies.
Right.
Ethics on. Right. Well, I found here a lot of possibilities because it's so powerful. That the notion of consider the nature itself or the animal life, right, like a meander being, right, like a being that is able to reconsider, rethink.
Right, right. Yeah, and another aspect that I haven't emphasized in this talk too much is that it prevents homogenization. It's not like everything becomes the same. And so I would argue that no animal life, no plant life, no natural life is homogenized unless we do it. You know, we make all the cows look and do the same thing. Despite all that, actually, every cow still has some kind of like own will, you know, but we try to kind of, you know, in bioengineering, like, or in the agriculture production that has become so homogenized, again, with a model of efficiency that is completely flawed. I think it's more efficient to actually have less homogenized, but animals are not homogenized. No nature is homogenized by definition. So the homogenization is a very important part of my thinking of that remeandering. And I can share some publications that I have about this kind of work with you, which is precisely about overcoming homogenization. And, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Any other question? Yeah. You can also put your question in Spanish and Laura will translate. So don't feel like, oh my goodness, I cannot have an English question.
Thanks for your talk. I was thinking while I was here to talk these meandering cultures, right? We are full of juxtapositions, historical terms between regions, backgrounds, and efforts to modernize our places. So I think meandering is something that open up thinking in terms of Western thinking, right? In terms of Western traditions, because of the linearity,
Right.
the modern thinking. So how, I mean, I think it's interesting to see for the case of thinking that in America, how we like assume our meandering still by, but also we use its limitations.
So some kind,
the linear thinking limitations.
right,
So I'm thinking transmodern way.
right.
So if we have this pattern of non-linearity that we need to like recreate with the linearity of the modern world. So, and I think that is the challenge of the purpose of decades.
Right.
So it's a comment that something that inspired me.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much for that comment. And I think you are right on. I'm not saying that we should not have any linearity. We need to be sure that this building will stay straight. We should not be afraid, like, oh my goodness, it might just all fall apart because it's not constructed according to the latest efficiency of scientific modeling, etc. That's not what I'm arguing. And so I think what you call transmodern, I really like that term. Transmodern actually will include linearity and meandering, but it will not be a privileging of linearity. And I visited the National Museum yesterday, you know, as being a real tourist, and I was really taken by how they had organized their exhibits. It was not a linear model of time, like first the ancient Colombian civilization, and then you end with, you know, postmodern culture paintings. They had made a very nice thematic mixture, showing how actually certain elements keep coming back as important, and so that combination of the variety of cultures, the variety of, and the importance of these different cultures, the importance of the different mentalities to foreground that. That's the art. It's very difficult. So I'm not just simply saying like, let's all meander and, but part actually of the transmodern, I would argue, is meandering. Meandering is actually integrated linearity and a slower mode of thinking. So in that sense, I think actually the meandering is the transmodern because it also gives space to linearity. And I agree that in a lot of places you need models of efficiency that have a more linear model. But I would argue that in the linear model, you need to make sure that you incorporate a longer and slower evaluation of different kinds of practices and materialities, instead of just implementing another wastewater treatment plant in a certain area without even knowing how the people are actually dealing with their wastewater and how their practices are around water issues. You see what I'm saying? So, so I think on a meta level, that is what meandering is, like to take also the linearity into account, but not a simplistic implementing of linearity whenever and wherever. Does that add to your comment? Thank you. Very, very nice comment. Very nice question. We would still have time for one question. Can be a Spanish question.
Well,
Yes.
I don't have a Spanish question, but I was thinking about the importance in, bringing this meandering concept into the public policies. I have nothing to do with politics, but just thinking about how much it would reduce the burden, the economical burden of the city if we stopped having to make rivers like linear and
Right.
allow them to meander. We wouldn't have this problem with the river is here in Bogotá, it always floods. And
Right.
they're trying to, stop the river from flooding, but that's the actual nature of the river.
Right.
And I don't know if you've gotten into this, but how do you relate the meandering concept with public politics or
Right.
violence?
Right. Yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you. Yeah, in Europe, we have the same problem of flooding cities, in climate change with more rain, more melting of the glaciers in the Mont Blanc and so forth, in the Alps, in the Pyrenees. And so one of the solutions to it, or one of the ways to mitigate this, to deal with this, has been a European program called Giving Room to Rivers, to actually let rivers re-meander. And of course, that cannot be done in the middle of a city like Amsterdam, because that means to basically remove all the buildings and give the water back to the land. And but it can be done in agricultural areas. This was a huge project because, of course, the farmers did not like that. And rightfully so, it was a problem for them. So it was a long process of negotiation and so forth. But it means looking into a future of how to actually let the water lead us. Look what the water wants in order to prevent floods. It's like what I said, flood is a human construction. And of course, there are human constructions. We live in a human construction. We live in a city that is a human construction. And so we don't want to we have floods in cities, but we can prevent some of this flooding by actually giving a lot of land back to the water and let it meander and let it build big floodplains. And so it was a big success when last year there was major flooding in Europe. And in part of my own country, my country is really tiny, but we have a lot of rivers because we are at the end of a lot of big rivers. And it really worked. Major city like Maastricht was not flooded because of these new projects. In towns, it's much harder. But there's a lot that could be done with the water infrastructure. And that is a lot of public policy. That's, what I mentioned with the flyers of the Los Angeles River. You need to present to people and work with them and create a shift in the mentality of how you actually think and manage rivers. Because people's first reaction is, of course, well, they need to do something about it. They need to build a big wall. So people need to be convinced that there are other ways of dealing with this. And even managers need to be first convinced. So that's a process of two ways, or many ways actually, of public policy. Public policy is crucial. I mean, to get the farmers to finally actually sell the land, the land was ultimately taken, but to make sure that they stayed viable in their own business, et cetera, was a lot of public policy, So it's a very important question. You cannot just say like, oh, let's all these rivers re-meander. No, we live in a very, our whole world is populated by humans. And that's the same with any policy. The policy in the Amazon, like how are we going to deal with all the conflicting interests, etc. So the model of meandering means exactly taking into account all these different interests and make them negotiate and talk but ultimately we have to listen to the materialities. It's not just only us that can decide. It's not only humanity. We are confronted with the agency of water, of any material, especially in climate change. And so that wake-up call is at the heart of meandering, that we take all these materialities into consideration, and we have to do that. It's not just up to us. We have to listen to the animals and so all these materialities tell us things, how to actually think different about controlling. And so many indigenous cultures have lived with water. If you go to Cambodia or they live in houses on stilts. Same actually, came with Laura has project in the Matavan. The villages are very far from the river. You could say like, well, that's not efficient. They need to walk in the raining season, the water comes right to the village, There's a reason why people build the way they build. And so that they lived with the water and with the land. They didn't talk about floods. In Cambodia, it's not a flood. They needed water. The Nile was the most fertile river, and because of the so-called floods, the floods brings new soil, because a river is not just water, but it's also sediment. So you get whole new soil every year. You get new soil and you get water. And then it goes away and you can have your agricultural, building. Most fertile setup. No human irrigation can even mimic that. All human irrigation projects are doomed to fail because we deplete the soil. It's really true. I mean, I'm not saying this as a kind of engaged environmental philosopher, but you see that already, and will be a big problem for big areas of agriculture production like California, because it's all human irrigation. And so the soil becomes completely depleted, and it becomes also loaded with the wrong kind of metals, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, public policy is crucial in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very I think inspiring and refreshing for everyone. And it will also give me a lot of material to work in my classes. From of Meandering. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And whenever so Venus Ramos, don't make us.
De ética. Entonces,